Part of the work that First Person Plural does is to raise an awareness and help people understand about dissociative identity disorder and dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. With this DVD, we want to talk about the 3 stages of therapy, but making sure that at every level, every point, that it's understood that this is never a linear journey. You'll dip backwards and forwards throughout. And because we're using 3 experts by experience, a supporter and 3 therapists, we're hoping to interweave their experiences, what they've learnt in their journeys through working with people, or living with the situation themselves, and show the commonalities as well as the differences. That's really, really what we want to capture on this. I think therapy naturally falls into, very loosely and broadly, into 3 stages. And I think it's very important that this recognition right from the start that this will never be a linear journey, but there will be 3, I think as a client I can identify the 3 stages very much on looking back, but when you're in it you can't see this for yourself.
People often get confused when we start talking about stages or phases, that, you know, you do this and then you do that and then you do the other and then you're finished. When actually in practice it doesn't go like that. In practice, in those 3 stages, you're going from stabilisation into trauma, from trauma back into stabilisation, from stabilisation into trauma. Occasionally, and I've had this experience, you will get kind of a jump over kind of sort of stabilisation into what seems like the 3rd stage for part of the system. And we've actually had part of the kind of sort of the more solidifying integration going on directly from a stabilisation. So it's possible to even do a jump over a stage. So what you get is you don't get a linear 1, 2, 3. What you get is a spiral where you can sort of revisiting the stages at appropriate steps, and that's just the way it is. And we have to get away from this idea that it's phase 1 followed by phase 2 followed by phase 3.
A lot of the time it feels like a chaotic process for both the therapist and the client, because you go back regarding different stages with different parts of the personality. So the received wisdom of stage-orientated treatment, stabilisation, prior to any memory work, prior to bringing things together, does have its limitations. I mean, you might do quite well, for example, stabilising certain parts of the personality that you know quite well and who get to know you, and lo and behold, as the work progresses, other parts of the personality might emerge who have not been part of that work, they haven't been around, so you've got to go back to it.
First stage is the what is loosely called stabilisation stage, and is achievable through gaining more understanding about your internal awareness and more internal cooperation, and educating yourself about the subject so it's not quite so terrifying, and learning skills and techniques that might help you before you go into the 2nd stage of the trauma work, skills that you can use throughout the whole of this journey to help you feel more grounded when it's got really tough and you're not there as fully as you'd like to be. So that when you do start the trauma work, and as I stress, this is not linear. The trauma work, there will be parts of trauma work in the 1st section, but it'll be much more contained in a holding environment.
It's called the stabilisation phase, and I think that is a very good way of describing it, because initially one thing you don't feel is stable, and because all the different parts are trying to have an influence on the life, the one life you're leading. Because something I think is very important to remember is that you know, we have separate parts. Other people use different terms, but we have separate parts, but we are still only one person.
Because I've changed therapists so often, it's very hard to see a specific linear journey in any sense, because with each therapist, obviously, I've got to build a relationship and make sure we've got a good enough container. However, with many of my therapists, I've already been in kind of quite open trauma by the time I've started with them, which has meant that the stabilisation process has been a little bit more complicated. So that meant that the phase model had to be quite adapted in my case.
So the stabilisation, really it's about getting to know you, building the relationship with your therapist, getting to know your therapist, allowing her to get to know you.
Well, stabilisation really is about finding strategies to stop the person being overwhelmed by memories of trauma, or helping them to deal with triggers that could be anything really they might encounter in their everyday life that will it's helping them to manage levels of fear, to reduce levels of fear and regulate their emotional state so that they can stay within a reasonable window of tolerance rather than get completely hyper aroused, over emotionally aroused, get anxious, worked up, suffer flashbacks and so on, or go into hypo-arousal, which is the shutting down, the dissociation and the numbing. And most dissociative people can flit quite quickly from one to the other, so they might get hyper-aroused and their only way of coping with it is then to shut down and just zonk out and become dissociative, which makes daily life quite difficult. So if you can look at things, just simple things that keep people in touch with the present, in touch with reality, sights, sounds, smells, or little things people can touch or hold. It's quite individual, really. The biggest difficulty I find is helping somebody, the adult part, to remain present, because the trouble is when people are overtaken by reminders of trauma or triggers in the environment, it's the traumatised parts that take over, and often the adult self then is lost touch with, or goes AWOL, or goes missing. So if you can help the adult to be more aware and more present, I think that is one of the main things, because you're trying to stop the person dissociating at the drop of a hat, which is partly habitual really, and that's why so really small things can act as triggers. Sudden noises or movements or smells, anything really.
I mean, I think I can't overemphasize the importance of the slow starting and to spend as much time as possible and necessary to get that beginning right. One of the difficulties, of course, is there is a sort of competing going on in terms of what I feel is the right approach and what that person's experience of life is. That person's experience of life is you do things quickly, you get on with it, you deal with it and tick it off. And so at some level, therapy is seen as let's just get on with it, let's do it, and then I can get out of it. So I'm trying to slow it down, and often I'm having to slow it down generally rather than say nothing's happening. It's more dealing with trying to slow down what's happening, whether it's trauma or anything else. Because if someone is engaged, that's what's likely to happen.
In my opinion, what needs to be done is that trauma needs to be fully acknowledged. It needs to be contained, and perhaps it isn't the time to go into resolving it, but it needs to be fully acknowledged. And if there's a voice wants to tell you some part of a story, then that needs to be heard.
It's really important to demonstrate that you've heard what the person is saying, but don't necessarily feel that I have to run all the way with it. Holding back sometimes and declaring that, saying, I don't think we're ready. As a team, you, me and everyone else that might be present, I don't think we're ready at the moment. And sometimes there's an exercise of power in the therapeutic relationship that as the therapist, it's important to say, we're going to stop.
The therapist's role then is to say, I've really heard that. Can we put it back in a container somewhere, maybe help with imagery to put the memory of the trauma back into a container. And then from there, go back into the stabilisation. Reinforce what you've already learned in the stabilisation phase. The part that's brought that memory, that bit of trauma into the may, because they've managed to bring it in, now engage more with the stabilisation phase. So you start with stabilisation, trauma may intrude. You have to deal with it. You can't ignore it. You can't say, we're not at that stage yet. You have to kind of deal with it in some way. It may not be the time the system, the whole of the person as a whole, may not be able to resolve that trauma yet, may not be strong enough, may not have enough communications, but you may be able to work with that part in allowing them to say what they had to say, and then encouraging them to kind of put it back, for them to bring up again at a later stage. Back into stabilisation, do more work, encouraging cooperation, co-consciousness, where parts are actually stay more aware of what each other are doing and saying.
The difference between dissociation trauma and, say, a simple trauma, like a post-traumatic stress, because in the simple traumas, you're angling for that. So you're looking for that description of the trauma, you're looking for the point where the person's narrative goes from being quite stable and quite calm to suddenly flashing, and we call it sort of a hot point. So you, in a way, as a therapist working with dissociation, you've got to remove yourself from that temptation to go with the trauma.
When, let's say, a part starts wanting to talk about the trauma, I have to say things like, I think what you've got to say is really important. You're beginning to tell me the horrible things you've had to deal with, but I've got to wait till I understand what's okay and what's not okay, and your rules inside. Okay, and I might do that like that, okay, or your rules inside. Now, not only am I trying to facilitate that part's awareness that they can't just willy-nilly pop out, but whatever the structure in there, those with power inside will be hearing what I'm saying, okay? And that may be the first time that very, I mean, you could use the different terms, like the protective defensive system, you could say, is saying, oh, this person's taking me seriously. He's not trying to get rid of me. He's not trying to be more powerful. He's saying to me, or to this part, you can't just do that. You've got to check what's okay and what isn't. So all the time, as well as talking to whoever is there, I'm trying to trying to be aware of talking to the whole of that person as one person.
So you could be working with someone who, on the surface, says that there hasn't been a great deal, and that there was, but I've dealt with it and it's not something I want to really go with. Then an alter comes out and says, well, actually, this is my experience, and starts going into it could be a hugely upsetting memory or experience, very graphic and potentially deeply unpleasant for all parties concerned to sit and listen to and to speak about. And not as a therapist to go, here we are, wonderful, finally got it. I know why this alter is in existence, it's because of that trauma, so let's bring it out and then we can deal with it. That's a temptation as a therapist to do that, and it can be one of those things that allows a therapist to believe that they're doing a really good job because I found the trauma today, isn't that great? I got there. The person was saying it wasn't there, and actually it is, and I've done great. That's really potentially really dangerous. So again, it's about acknowledging the alter's presence, thanking the alter for being there and saying it's fantastic that you feel able to come out and tell me this stuff. But I'm not sure how much permission we've got to work with it. So you've told me what you've told me. Let's see how this pans out. So is it going to be okay when you go back inside that that's the case? Or is it going to be that somebody might have an issue with that? But also they might be telling me something that the person, effectively my patient, if you like, don't know anything about. So one of the agreements that I have with any person that comes into therapy is that if you dissociate, I'll tell you what's happened when you come back. But if an alter's come out and given me a traumatic memory, that I believe the person does not know, that's a very difficult situation to be in. Do I give them the trauma memory? Or, because then I'm giving it as a sort of a person once removed, or do I wait until they can speak with the alter directly? Because they may have no knowledge that that trauma memory's come out. So I have to be very careful how I proceed. I think acknowledging that it's there, thanking the alter, but checking out to see if it is okay and looking for permission. And if I think there are 20 alters within the system, of which that one is just one, I'm looking for 19 signatures to say it's okay for that one to tell me that thing.
For myself, I wanted to get to know my internal parts. I wanted to understand them. Because after all, I'm only a part of the whole. I'm not the executive or the hierarchy in any way, although I do most of the outside living. But as more growing awareness about my situation, how much every individual part influenced my daily living, and wanting to know why. Because knowing why, you can then, if it's something you're not all happy with, you can do something about. But if you don't understand the why, it's just behaviour modification rather than actual change that'll last. So it was getting to know what I call my internal family. Other people call them parts, other people call them alters. Terminology is very, very important to us each as an individual who's going through the process. And there again, is there no right or wrong, but I feel very close to my different parts, and it feels much more like a family. So it was getting to know them well, trying to find out, what they found most difficult, what might upset them, what might be triggering, so we could manage all these things while they were doing it. It's learning about all that before you enter into the trauma work, because then when you enter into the trauma work, you've got some way of managing it, having an understanding about why and where they've come from to a certain extent, what things they like, because trauma work is so difficult. But if they've all got built-in things that they enjoy doing, books they enjoy reading, colouring, walks they like, playing with conkers, it's there. It's like an external child. If they've got to have a nasty procedure, you put in place the treat afterwards. So with the trauma, it's like working through. It's not exactly treats, but it's getting a whole life instead of it's all being trauma-based.
I mean, over and over again, we need to revisit what does help, like to be reminded to, like we find journaling quite helpful, or we did for a long time, and my therapist gave me a book with a lock on it. And although it was mostly symbolic, but the idea was that things could be locked away and then put down until our next session. So she encouraged us to write stuff in it that was to be held until the next session. Because one of the problems that happens, certainly in the early stages, is that trauma feels very real. It feels very, very present, and it's really hard to remember that sort of find a way to contain it until your next therapy session. But a sort of sense of how do you contain, until you can learn to contain it inside, until you can say to people inside, it's okay, it's okay, we can wait. That's been a big thing for me, is how once the flashbacks start, or once the trauma work opens, how do you wait? Often for me, it hasn't really worked to say you need to stay quiet. So it's more like, well, how can we express it, but in a way that can wait? So a drawing or journaling or leaving answering machine messages can sometimes help, obviously depending on the boundaries your therapist has chosen to set with you. Posting things, that was quite useful for a long time. One of my alters particularly used to write it down and then put it in the post box. Because I think it was a sense of like, right, it's on the way to my therapist. So that was really helpful. And somehow the physicality was much easier for her than email. The actual act of writing it, putting it in an envelope, putting a stamp on it, writing the address on it, knowing it was going there. I think it was kind of like almost a mimicking of our journey there, but a few days earlier. So that was really helpful. But these things all depend on which alter's around and what your therapist and you can set up, I think.
Absence is inevitable, is very hard to cope with, but needs kind of acknowledging very early on, and the therapist with the client needs to negotiate the kind of things that might help. It helped to know when the holidays were coming as early as possible. It helped to pre-prepare for exercises we were going to do at home for that period, and it helped to have what's called a transitional object, which is a defined term, but for me it meant something that belonged and was significant to my therapist that she loaned to me during our holiday time, so we could have part of what was our therapist with us all the time she was on holiday.
People do need places to retreat to. Part of stabilisation is creating a safe place inside. But again, that's been quite difficult. Different parts need different kinds of places. People need lots of different, depending on how dissociative they are and how many different parts they've got. They might need a whole load of different places for different ages, developmental stages. And the whole notion of safety is not an easy one to get across, and it can be very useful before you start blithely talking about safe places with dissociative survivors to find out what safety means to them. Is it a good word? Is it a helpful word? It might be a dangerous word. Abusers might have told them that they were safe when they weren't. For example, you might need to find another word. But you're basically trying to find out what is right for that person and different parts of them.
It took a long, long time when I first began therapy, which was specifically targeting my DID. It took a long, long time for any of our other parts to actually come out, despite the fact we knew we were DID. So the initial part of therapy, it was me and the therapist, and me trying to stay permanently, solidly there, pretending that there was no one else to work with. And it was only as my relationship with the therapist started building and becoming more stronger that it was allowed. And I describe it that way because it didn't feel like me, Catherine, that was allowing it. It was allowed for other parts of the system to engage with that.
Most people suffer from internal conflicts between parts of themselves to a greater or lesser degree. So if you can introduce the principles, the principle is compassion for every part, communication with every part, connection with every part, working together. So we're trying to create teamwork, a therapeutic team or an internal family. Now that again is a difference with parts who've been installed deliberately by abusers. They do not function as an internal family. They're not part of any internal family you might try to create. So it might be a good idea. I do try to find whatever parts I can who are ready, able and willing to work with me to set up a therapy team. Team so-and-so, say the person's name is Jane. I talked to the other, we need a team Jane here to work together. I can be part of the team. And different parts of you can be all parts of the team, and then you can be on a stronger footing to approach more difficult traumatised parts or installed parts who are more difficult to communicate with.
Once they'd started to engage, it was about building the communication between us. So we started journaling, we started sharing our journal. Other parts would take part in the journal. We'd started sharing our journaling with the therapist. It was important for our therapist, if another part had come out in therapy, for her to share, if I wasn't aware, for her to share what had happened in the therapy session. Similarly for the other parts, if they asked, what had happened when Catherine was there and I wasn't, it was important that she let them know what Catherine was up to while they weren't aware.
A lot of the work, I think, is with the EPs, as they're called, the emotional personalities behind the dissociative barriers, because the difficulty is that the person that presents, that makes the appointment, gets themselves to therapy and so on, the adult, the apparently normal personality, often is amnesic or doesn't really know much about their dissociative parts or is avoidant of them. So the therapy, a useful role is to act as what's called a relational bridge between the adult self and the emotional personalities inside. So if you can relate it's like shuttle diplomacy really, if you can relate to the adult part, understand their difficulties about having to relate to a dissociative world inside, relate to the separate dissociative parts and then act as a link between them, a bridge between them, and help them to communicate and relate to one another.
Building the communication, I guess, is the key thing, because without the building of the communication between the parts, it's very hard to build cooperation, which is what you're kind of sort of aiming for ultimately. So I see it as kind of, so you go communication, cooperation, and then hopefully co-consciousness as well. But the communication is crucial. Now, I'm fairly well on in my journey, but I have not yet achieved all the communication with all my parts, which again highlights the fact that this is not a linear journey.
As someone who has experienced abuse, has experienced trauma that they were too young to deal with, they have no system to deal with it, and so it's all had to be stored away. Not only that, the storing away means that it can't be touched on. And it may be further not touched on because the message may have been from an abuser, and it's often the case. You tell anyone and you're in trouble, or you're dead, or I'll damage you, or I'll hurt someone precious to you. And so everything is a hierarchy, it's a power hierarchy of trying to keep that structure closed in, okay? And that means before you can set off doing anything about trauma work, you have to first of all find out how that structure is. And so one of the things you don't do, which may be different from people's experiences of working with more straightforward trauma or PTSD, is really you do everything to try and carefully and politely stop any trauma work coming up. You're trying to see what the structure like, to try and get some stability, because what you're wanting to do, which is why another reason why short-term work doesn't work, is that person, it may be the first time that they have a chance to experience some continuity. Okay. Now that means that up to now, dissociation is about never being overwhelmed by what has just happened. So that you keep dealing with the crisis, you tick it off, and you move to the next place. And so a lot of people, they have no experience of a timeline. Most of us who don't dissociate, where there's been a good enough experience of our childhood, we can get ourselves to remember something. We can remember 3 months ago, 6 months ago in therapy and with friends and what we've done and weddings we've been to, and good and bad experiences in our childhood, either because someone's come up with them or we recognize it in our children or something like that. And though we may be emotional about it, depending on what it is, we're not blocked off. Now, someone who's highly dissociative, it works because literally you who's dealing with life outside has no connection with that past. So you tick it and you go on, which is why people who come for therapy for a while may feel literally that every time they come, it's the first time they've been there, a bit like Groundhog Day or something. You know, it's a repetition with no memory of having been there. What you're trying to create is a benign continuity and structure that is sufficiently, you could say boringly the same, okay, so that there is a sense of beginning to feel like you can then remember that experience because there's no need to forget it.
That stabilisation is important so that you understand what the resources of that person may be, what they can tolerate in terms of the level of being pushed or encouraged within therapy, and what they do when they leave the therapeutic room. I'm very much aware that although therapy is being seen to be a hugely important part of the journey through to growth or recovery in dissociation, therapy is only 1 hour in a period of days of which that person has to exist outside of the therapeutic room. So knowing what happens outside the therapeutic room is vital.
If there is someone has got involvement with the psychiatric services, it may be important to try and make sure, and you're working with them, which needs to be if that's the case, you need to try and make sure that there's good communication between everybody, that we're all singing from the same song sheet. Otherwise, you know, the natural tendency of someone who's surviving that way is to keep sort of splitting, in the sense that you're one thing with your therapist and you're something else with a professional carer and something else with your family. And so that's part of trying to get the whole structure. In the same way, if someone is forever moving from place to place or too busy, too involved, there's not really going to be enough time to give enough importance to the therapy. So all of those are really important. And it may be that this is something that takes many, many months or even a year or so, depending on the level of instability. You've got to spend all that time because everything that will depend on that.
I found it very important for me to begin to learn and understand about DID because I had no knowledge whatsoever. So some people won't go near that, will never want to read a thing about it. For others, you lap up all the information you can.
The initial stage is very educational anyway. I put a lot of emphasis on psychoeducational tools, things that people can look up or find out, or information I can provide them with to help them understand their own condition and how to manage it.
Whereas we hopefully are able in our lives to balance up times of being excited or stirred up or in hyperarousal, whether it's doing some exciting sport or whatever it is, or the intensity of our relationship. There are other times when we're happy to be more quiet, whether it's reading or going for long walks. So, what seems to work well generally is to have a balance on that. Now, with a lot of people with extreme dissociation, the only way of feeling alive is when you're in hyperarousal, when you're actually in crisis.
It was important that we didn't, any parts of us, didn't get hyper-aroused while we were trying to build that communication. So there was a lot of work about our therapist when she noticed we were getting overexcited or if we were getting over-emotional about anything in any way, to ground us again. And very physical things in the sense of grounding, standing up and walking around the room, holding ourselves, knowing we were there in the body. Much later on, even kind of allowing our therapist to touch us as a grounding thing, describing things in the room as a grounding. That brought us back into a space where we weren't too hyper. Because when we were hyper, our parts were more scattered, if that makes sense. So there was a lot of emotion there, but actually not much communication. So that was important during the early stages. It was also important for our therapist to keep making it known that she was happy to meet any one of us that wanted to speak. Or they could just come out and not speak if that's what they wanted, or they could just tell whoever was out at the time that they were there, and that would encourage cooperation because parts would actually, who had never actually kind of communicated before, would hear our therapist say, well, if you've got something to say on this but you don't want to speak to me, tell Catherine. And I'd suddenly hear this voice that I'd never heard before saying, tell her. And often it was an angry voice. Often it was kind of a part saying, tell her what rubbish she is. Tell her we don't need a therapist. That kind of thing. But I was kind of then put in a position, I was communicating that. But that was actually a start of me communicating with that part as well. Not just that part communicating with our therapist.
In order to stabilise somebody with installed dissociation, you very often have to undo the things that have been installed, because that is what is destabilising them quite deliberately. Some people have had features, aspects or training installed in them so that if they ever start to talk about their trauma, or if they get into any kind of helping relationship, for example, they will automatically destabilise because parts of them have been taught that's what they have to do, that's their job. Or they might destabilise in a pretty serious way. Suicidal parts might come forward, but those suicidal parts are different to spontaneous suicidal parts who are just, that we might understand more easily, that are really just so despairing and desperate they think, oh well, the best thing is just to get out of here. That is totally different from an installed suicidal part is there specifically to murder themselves or to say, look, if you're going to talk about this, then you are going to feel like killing yourself.
With this journey, however well you've prepared, there will be times when there'll be crisis situations. It might be from external real life factors that are just overwhelming, and it can tip the whole of the system, the whole of the internal family into an absolute chaos. But that will be dealt with in a slightly different way of looking at how to manage the external crisis. But we are human, daily life is going on. Another form of crisis is when you've really lost touch perhaps with reality. You don't have any means to get back on your own, if you like, get back into control of your life on your own, what you need around you to help contain and support you and re-establish that groundedness that you so much want to be able to do.
I do need other things in place, like I was saying, more than one person in my care team, friends sometimes, not necessarily to tell them that it's a crisis, but just to be with. Rabbits help me, things like that. And also a kind of awareness that they will happen. If you've got DID, there will be crisis times, and that doesn't necessarily make them easier, but at least it feels like this. And my therapist reminds me they'll pass. And although at the time I sometimes hate her and think, they won't, you have no idea what this feels like. Like, how can you just tell me it'll all be better in a week? But actually they do pass, especially if they're date related. They do pass, and it can be really hard to think this level of pain is going to happen again next year, but there are good bits in between. In my experience, and obviously I can only speak to my experience, I do think my system knows when it's okay to talk and when we're just about safe enough. But this therapy is always done on a knife edge. I mean, there's just no way around it. You're always playing with that line between what's safe enough and what's too traumatic. But then equally, if you don't do the trauma, then you end up in this position where nothing's being worked on. So it's a constant dance, I think, between the two. But as long as your therapist is aware of that, then at least it's a conversation that can happen.
What I would say about stabilisation, it's a wonderful thing, and we'd like to think that we could keep our clients stable, but in fact, I think part of the healing is learning to deal with cycles of rupture and repair, because all good attachment relationships in childhood, all relationships get disrupted. There is no perfect relationship that doesn't suffer some kind of dysregulation. So in a secure attachment, you have an attachment relationship, something comes along to dysregulate it, you get some kind of rupture to the relationship. But in a good attachment relationship, the caregiver will then repair it and you get back to the secure base and the attachment. Now, severely traumatised people have repeatedly suffered severe rupture without any repair. So we can learn a lot from periods of destabilisation. If the person starts to learn that things can be repaired, being destabilised isn't really the end of the world. What matters is the repair.
The second stage is the trauma stage, which is working through the traumas. Again, everybody will do this in totally different ways.
It's hard to define when that should be. It certainly isn't after a certain number of sessions you're moving into trauma work.
The main thing in therapy, I think, is to avoid re-traumatisation, because every time a person is re-traumatised, reminded of the trauma, overwhelmed by the trauma, or reenact the trauma in some way, that reinforces all the neuronal networks that are wired for trauma, and they're the ones that you're trying to change. You're trying to rewire those neuronal networks. So it's very important to avoid that. And if you go into traumatic memories too soon, the likelihood is that the person will simply relive them. They will be re-traumatised. So you need to have a really good, strong working relationship with the person to work out with them how they will approach their memories sufficiently in order to process them, but also have sufficient distance in a way in order not to be overwhelmed by them.
There won't be suddenly one day you'll stay at the end of stage 1, oh, I'm ready to start stage 2. You'll find that you're naturally going into the trauma work and staying much more grounded. You're finding you can apply the techniques that you've learnt in stage 1 as you're doing deeper trauma work, and that's where the role of the therapist is so important, to help you to do the level of trauma work which is appropriate for you at the right time, knowing and able to return to stage 1 to help yourself get yourself back together at the end of the trauma work. So then the trauma work will perhaps become the much more dominant part of the therapy, but you will dip in and out the whole time, using those skills, using the knowledge you've learnt, but updating them every time. What you've done the first time to ground yourself, you might tweak the second time.
So you can think that everything's stable, that the person is functioning well, resources are on hand, and that they've actually got a good grip on their lives and their context. Then you step into the trauma section, and some of the memories and some of the experiences and the feelings start emerging, which can instantly destabilize somebody. So if that's the case, you don't stay in the trauma phase. I wouldn't then go, okay, well, we're here now, so let's keep going. I would say, well, let's pause. We can come back to this, but maybe we need to revisit. Wonder why it is possibly that some of the stabilization work we put into practice isn't doing well enough. So you're still finding it difficult to cope. And let's spend a bit of time there before we go back to the trauma phase.
When I first entered therapy, I had no idea I had been abused as a child or that I was DID. And trauma memories were coming up once I'd begun to trust my therapist and the relationship was building up. Trauma memories were flooding me totally. And I had not learnt any skills of stabilisation, of grounding myself. And again, because I didn't know I was DID, I had no idea about what was happening to myself or ourselves. So the whole thing was an absolute nightmare because I lost sight of all that I could do. I lost the ability to put a meal together, run a home. Everything just disappeared because the trauma was flooding me. This is why I think the first stage of therapy is absolutely vital. It won't prevent, there'll be times when trauma overwhelms, but if you've got no foundation to go back to, and after all, if you've been badly abused as a child, you're not going to have been equipped with skills for coping in any way. You've got through life by the skin of your teeth, not because you've built up skills for managing, because that goes against everything as a child that you would have been encouraged to do. So the first stage is absolutely, for me, I see it's so important to have a point of reference, to have something solid to go back to. It won't always feel that it is solid. It'd be very hard to get back there. And this is why in crisis stages, it's how you're helped to return to what you have learnt previously. But if you've never learnt it, you've got nowhere to go back to. And for myself, it was like, I was just for several years, trauma was my life, and I was re-traumatising myself. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but in therapy, re-traumatising myself time after time after time, trying to pick myself up. And as the outside part, I was determined to keep going, which I did. But it was hell. And I don't think this journey is ever easy, but I don't think it has to be quite as difficult as mine was at the start.
Well, to work with trauma, you need at least 4 of the 5 C's in place. You need good communication within the person's system and with you as the therapist. You definitely need compassion for the parts who've been traumatised. You need cooperation and collaboration. And if you've got those things in place somehow or another, you can then look at connecting with the traumatised parts. Now, there are many ways of doing that. And this is where I think creative communication comes in a lot. We need props. We're dealing with right brain processes that don't lend themselves very well to left brain language. Sometimes the person can tell you about their trauma using left brain language, but without necessarily connecting with the emotional components of it, the feelings, which are of course held in the right brain. And this is where creative means of communication can be very helpful. Drawing, writing. People very often bring their own artifacts along. They bring things, or they will work at home in their own creative way, and they will maybe bring drawings to therapy, or we can use toys in the therapy. Different toys or animals can represent different parts of them. We can not reenact trauma per se, but we can reenact it therapeutically. We can change the trauma narrative.
It's very much the relationship with the therapist as indeed is so vital for each stage, because by the second stage, hope you will have built up a trust with the therapist, a trust that when they are helping you to contain the trauma, that they're not rejecting you, but that it's so important you're grounding in this, you're working at it in sizes that are manageable for the whole of you, not going, well, hell for leather just to get it over and done with, because it just doesn't happen and work like that. So that's the second stage, which is often the most painful, and unless things are good enough around you, I personally think it's not right to enter doing the trauma work until you've got some support.
I think the biggest thing is actually the feeling. Like, how does it feel in the room? Does this person feel right to me? And trusting that, because I think the people I've worked well with who have turned out to be the right therapist for me, I've known pretty much straight away.
Once the system has got enough communication together internally that the trauma is coming up in a more shared way, so it's intruding on the stabilisation phase, but it is coming up. There's more parts of the system are sharing some information about trauma, and I would say, and that has certainly been that's the time when a movement towards the trauma stage is probably right, but that'll be at different times for different people. And also it may be, the trauma that is brought up in therapy, it may be you need to move into the trauma stage and process that particular incident of trauma, or that particular fragment of an incident of trauma, try and process that, and then immediately move back into stabilisation, because the thing about trauma work is it does actually destabilise the system. The difference between being unstable at the start of therapy and the destabilisation after a piece of trauma work is, if you've done the stabilisation phase well enough, you will have more internal resources to stabilise yourself. So you won't have to spend as long stabilising after a piece of trauma work.
I learned to be able to use many of the skills I'd learned wherever I was, work, out there doing the shopping. If I you learn to use what you've learned in a much more flexible manner. So when you've done a lot of the trauma work, during the trauma work there will be crisis times when hopefully in the earlier part of the work you will have set in place what needs to happen during those crisis times. It's really important that that's talked about earlier on, rather than you've actually got in a crisis and then you're left to find a way through. It'll be probably at those times using people around you. You might have set things in place with your therapist to make this possible. So you will have using so many techniques.
Often the trauma emerges as just a pure feeling state. There's no narrative with it. There's no reason why the feeling is there. So an absolute feeling of terror, perhaps, but no sense of why you're terrified. And part of the processing is to try and get the other parts of the system that know why the terror is there to actually share that knowledge. So you join up the sense of terror with the what happened, and working outside the purely rational side of the brain. So you're engaging with the feeling side of the brain, and consciously being aware that you need to stay as grounded as possible through that.
I find in therapy it's essential that I have a therapist who's prepared to use touch, because that's incredibly grounding and brings me back quite quickly and is very soothing as well. So, and obviously that's a complicated issue, and I know a lot of therapists find it controversial, and it has to be right in the relationship, and I would never advocate it falsely. But it's for me, it's been very, very helpful to have a therapist who's prepared to hold our hand or give us a hug. It's very grounding. And there are certain things as you go through therapy that you've discovered, like there are certain things I think are vital for my system, but there are other things I thought were vital that turned out not to be. But that's something you've got to build. I mean, I've been in therapy for more than 10 years now, so obviously I've got a sort of a toolkit, if you like, where I've worked out what I really need and what I can live without.
In terms of what the therapist is hearing, I think it's important that he or she communicates belief in what they're hearing. Now, belief for me is not, I don't expect the therapist to actually know that exactly what any one of us is saying is exactly objectively what happened. But I do want and expect and find it useful if the therapist can communicate to me that she knows that we are telling the truth, that we are not lying.
I think a therapist has to leave time at the end of the session, at least if asked, to say, well, this alter was here, this is what we talked about, because, or I mean, there are other ways of doing it. Some people, I think, record their sessions. I haven't felt comfortable doing that, but I do think there has to be a way, and also it adds to how do you have internal communication? It's the foundation of integration, is to be told gradually what your alters have brought and what they've said. And occasionally I have a hard time, not exactly believing, but kind of being in touch with what my alters have experienced in their past. And my therapist has to say to me, you need to try and be here. You need to try just a little bit at a time to be here while they're talking. But the first stages of that are her telling me what they've said. And then gradually, because that's sort of a bit like testing the water, a bit like, because obviously it's new information to me. And if I could bear it, I wouldn't have split in the first place. So it has to be a gradual process. And then for me, the initial stage of that process is my therapist telling me what's happened. And then gradually that sort of acclimatizes me to it so that I can gradually be there more and more while they're talking. And there are certain alters now that I'm pretty much always co-conscious with because I know all of their history. So anything they've got to say isn't a shock to me. And that's what I've realised in my system creates co-consciousness, is being able to bear what that alter's got to say. And that's when I can then be co-conscious with them. And then it obviously spreads into other parts of life. So with the alters that I'm co-conscious with in terms of their trauma, I can also be co-conscious with in terms of what they want for dinner. But I have learned for me over the years that I need a therapist who's prepared to tell me what was happening in the session. Because obviously it was my session, it's my body, it's my system. And I wouldn't be able to work with someone who, I mean, obviously occasionally time runs out. It's not always possible, but as a fundamental, it needs to be something that a therapist factors in, because that's how co-consciousness begins. And co-consciousness is a foundation of integrative living, I think.
I think the other thing in the trauma stage I want to come back at is the spiral process, and that in trauma work it's encouraging throughout the trauma work process, encouraging and reminding me as a client that I have actually got my own skills to help me stabilise myself, and I no longer need to react the way that my brain is programmed to react, because because I've done very good stabilisation work. I can now stabilise myself. I don't always remember it when I'm in the middle of trauma work. I need reminding of those skills that I've learned to ground myself. It's important in a session where trauma work has been dominated the session that the therapist takes responsibility for allowing enough time at the end of the session for the person to ground themselves and to stabilise themselves, to face the world outside again. And that is the therapist's responsibility, to hold that timekeeping. That's part of the boundary work. So you don't want to be giving more time unless it's been pre-negotiated, because the client is still in a traumatised place. But you need to be managing the session in a way that by the end of the time you have available, your client is stable enough to actually leave that session and go out in the big wide world and not still be locked into the trauma.
I think this is where it comes back to having a really good therapy relationship, because as long as the trauma is held there, there's almost a freedom to go, right, well, that's where my trauma is, now I'm going to go to the park. Whereas the times I haven't had a good enough therapy, it's spilt much more into day-to-day life because my alters have been trying to communicate.
So you've done the work in stage 1, where you've learnt the techniques, you've learnt about the situation, and you go, in a good enough sitting, you go into the trauma work. But during the trauma work, a lot of it will be so difficult, so painful. And of course your brain, the whole reason you've survived as well as you have, is your brain's used to, when it goes near trauma, shutting down, not making it available, or just one part holds that little bit of memory and that's not going to be made accessible to other parts. So it might sound very easy, okay, we've got all these skills, so now we enter trauma work and we'll get on with it. But of course you don't, because the whole of your neural pathways in your brain are set up to make you forget, not to cooperate, not to join up thinking. So you're working all the time with this sort of, at the start it can feel like an enormous battle.
Suddenly something happens that becomes overwhelming and you start feeling like you can't manage this, that this is too much. You're then able to say, do you remember when you first started 3 months ago? I remember that time when we had something similar. Can you remember what we did and what you managed to do? And if that's worked well enough, for the first time, possibly, I mean, that's important, that was, oh yes, I remembered that I did this, and that though I felt I wasn't going to last the night, I did last the night, or whatever it is. And that is huge, because you're going back to the first time to use a resource that's not survival resource, but a developmental resource of having experienced a stability, and then being able to then use that internalized experience through the therapy to be able to give you the confidence to manage the next one.
As the different parts gain confidence and trust that this actually process, as hard as it is, actually we do begin to feel better. I don't have, each part won't experience such high levels of anxiety continuously. So there are benefits beginning to feel throughout the whole. When you set it up originally, it's like setting up the basics, and each time you go back, you're developing the basics, you're adjusting them, you're thinking, yes, that used to work. Actually, it doesn't work like that anymore. But actually, if I do this now, and yep, that works now. So it's forever revisiting. It's a whole, and we've not been used to working as a whole. This is absolutely new for us. So to be able to return to something we've already learned and use it, and then go back into what we were doing, is absolutely something that I'd never done in my life. So that in its own way was a very healing part of the whole journey.
The third stage of therapy is usually referred to either as the consolidation phase, sometimes it's referred to as the integration phase. I don't like it being referred to as the integration phase because it infers this sense of what you're aiming for is a being one, rather than being a functional multiple. What we're aiming for, in my opinion, is not necessarily the sense of integration where we experience ourselves only as one person. What we're aiming for is a sense of an integrated sense of all the personality states working together and being aware of each other and cooperating with each other in an integrated way.
The reconciliation and consolidation is what is happening. All the work you've done up till that moment has been leading to you becoming much more grounded without having to keep using grounding techniques, a feeling of solidness, a feeling of knowing who you are. Even if the parts are all very separate, there's much more a feeling of being together and sharing the body, sharing the life, as opposed to everybody wanting their own rights within this life. It's much more a feeling of living my life now rather than watching it passing me by. I've entered it, I'm on it, it's my life, I'm actually in there living it, making decisions about what I want, knowing that because of all the work we've done, we're all making that decision. I'm not going off at a tangent making the decision I want, but it's what we all need and want at this stage.
You kind of work on what's here and now, and hopefully it builds the blocks for the future, but most people don't live a life going, right, in 5 years' time this is my point, in 10 years' time this is my point. And I think integration's a bit similar. I think it's probably because DID is quite an unusual diagnosis still, that therapists, especially ones who haven't been working with it intensively, get quite panicky about whether or not they're going to manage to integrate their client. But I don't think it looks any different at the beginning. It's about exploring your system and building tools to manage it, and internal communication. And I think internal communication probably is a foundation stone of integration, but not necessarily that would be the end product. You need internal communication either way.
I used to be much clearer about what I thought integration was, and I'm nowhere near so clear nowadays. I think for integration, from the very first moment, your dissociative structure is not so rigid and holds all the memories so separate, and your behaviours so separate, and you're able to communicate totally separate. That first moment, that very first step of that structure not being as rigid as that, is the very first moment of starting to integrate. And integration to me is just, to begin with, it's more of an awareness, because everybody is beginning to be aware that they're not the only person living in this body. So they're becoming more aware of other people's needs internally. So integration is a more of a cooperation, an agreement, and at this stage of where I am at now, I find it's much more about joined up thinking. An example, when I used to go away, I used to have to take 3 or 4 enormous bags of stuff because I had to cater for everybody. No, sorry, I didn't cater for everybody. Everybody helped me pack. And so I had enormous amount of stuff, from stuff for a baby right through to me as a much older woman. And that could be challenging, but it was absolutely essential for us to be able to be safe enough to go away for a night. This was essential. Now I can go and throw a few clothes in a bag, and if I haven't got it quite right, it doesn't mean we won't be able to do what we wanted to do the next day. We can accommodate that. It's fine. So that's integrated thinking, in that I don't have to pack for everybody now, or we don't all have to pack. And so they're nowhere near as separate, but I'm so aware of everybody there helping. But it's all in one thought process. It's not in all individual thought processes that I have to keep listening for and doing, or they take over and do. It's just totally different.
So I don't go for this notion of being completely integrated, but it is definitely about trying to bring in a more integrated way of thinking and feeling, so that there is time to think about things before you automatically, in a defensive survival mode, strike before you're hit, which is no thinking time, which is why people, as I've said earlier, go from hyper to hyperarousal. And what we're trying to do is expand the time to think through what's going on, to assess the situations, the emotional impact and the cognitive impact, before you decide what's the right action, which is more likely to be beneficial for you. And to have more communication, some people will find that if they've got a number of parts, that it'll minimize or become less and less, or it may be some people don't want that, but there is good communication between all the parts, and that the adult, when they're out in the world, is allowed to be adult and not impeded, like you haven't got a child there that tries to interrupt your work, and at home appropriate time is given for the more emotional, maybe sometimes child needs, to be able to be fair, as you hope you would be in a family. And the importance is to keep on being mindful of that and keep not changing it from what often is like World War III inside to one in which there's not always agreement but cooperation, respect, and knowing that the problem was not from inside, the problem was what's happened from outside.
My general aims all the way through are kind of, how do I make it more stable? How do I mean that I'm looking after my system more than my therapist? Although I believe that absolutely the therapist models it first, because I haven't been able to do anything with my autism my therapist hasn't done first.
The stage of consolidation kind of reveals itself and threads itself right through the process, rather than kind of sort of being a very defined stage in any way. It's something that occurs throughout the process, throughout all stages actually. And at the very end of the journey, you may be doing more of the learning to live as how you've become now. But actually the becoming who you are now has been part of the whole process.
Stage 3 can be quite demanding actually once a person starts to heal and they develop a different relationship with themselves. That doesn't occur in isolation. All their relationships with the outside world start to shift. Their relationship with you will need to change and adapt, but that, at least by that stage, hopefully you can handle that, work it out together. But it's more difficult with friendships, partnerships and people on the outside that may have known the person as one kind of person, which they're not really. Some partnerships might be able to adapt. It's good if they can, but some partnerships might not, or friendships might not be good for the person. The person might not function at such a high level of efficiency at work is another thing, because they might have had to rely on dissociation. Now, as a person heals, they won't be able to function like that quite so well anymore. They might need to think of adapting. They might need, for example, just in practical terms, they might need to reduce their hours at work, or even think of a different job, or maybe taking some time out if it's economically viable. It's very challenging.
It's a time also of loss, because you're looking back, and for myself, I have just finished paid work, but there's very much a 16-year-old aspect of ourselves who really at this stage would like to be looking at her career path through life, and we're having to juggle and find what is able to satisfy both those needs, because realistically the body might be a little old to be planning a 40-year career, but that's not the end of it. And in a way for us with First Person Plural, she is able to do a lot of things as she would do in a career. So we're finding a way through. It's juggling. It's so, but it's a loss that we never actually chose what we wanted to do in life. A lot of the time, it just was happening, as it is indeed for most people. I'm not pretending this is brownie points for people with DID. Lots of us reflect back, and there's good things and bad things, but there are huge losses as well as lots of very positive things. Enormous losses of not being able to remember so many things that other people just take for granted.